Honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to be part of this debate, important debate on an important subject, climate change. However, I'm also very disappointed to have a debate that's predicated on one of the parties in this House, that's the New Democratic Party, playing politics with such an important issue. The time is long past when we should be using this as a topic to divide parties, to insert into the motion some text that makes it an egregious insult to those in the Liberal Party of Canada who have done so much good work on this issue and have advanced this issue so far. Frankly not worthy of the good intentions and the integrity of the members of the New Democratic Party. So I was very disappointed to see this issue being used in this way. And the time to debate the science of climate change is over. Apparently there's some conservative members who are speaking out here because perhaps they still think that climate change science should be denied or mistrusted. But frankly, Mr. Speaker, they're in such a small minority on this planet at this point that they're marginalizing themselves. So what we have is an issue that crosses countries, it crosses cultures, it crosses everything. It is a human species issue. And what we need to be doing as a species is cooperating to solve this issue. This issue is so complex that it touches people in the whole range of our society, the whole range of the global community, and we need to work cooperatively together. We cannot advance on this issue with the kind of divisive tactics that, frankly, this motion itself embodies. So that's my disappointment. It is not a Canadian issue, it is a global issue. The atmosphere does not have national boundaries to it. We will be experiencing the effects of American, of Chinese, of French, of every other country's greenhouse gas emissions and vice versa. And this is an issue that is costing lives, it's costing species, and it's costing the security of our future on this planet. It's not just low-lying islands like Tuvalu or low-lying deltas in the South Asia. It's also the forests of British Columbia, where we have 70 million cubic meters of pine that was decimated by changing climate and warmer winters. It's not just the floods in Manhattan that costed billions, it's also floods in Winnipeg, in First Nations communities around Winnipeg, in low-lying suburbs of Greater Vancouver. It's not just droughts in the Midwest or hugely costly drought in Australia and in China, it's also droughts in the Nicola Valley in British Columbia, droughts that are costing the Okanagan Valley wineries and impacts on Great Lakes and Lake Winnipeg. And Mr. Speaker, salmon, which is the iconic species of British Columbia and First Nations, we saw a 90% drop in the Fraser River sockeye salmon returns, and climate change is part of that impact. Do we accept a world in which we might not have salmon in British Columbia in 50 years because of acidification of our ocean, because of the warming of the streams in which those young salmon fry have to survive, because of the change in the food cycle that nourishes the salmon when they come into the ocean? That's impacting our salmon right now, and the situation is already desperate for many of salmon species. So, Monsieur le Président, nous avons une course contre la montre. Cet enjeu de changement climatique, c'est urgent. Et nous les Canadiens, les gens de tous les pays, c'est comme nous avons un auto dont le moteur ne fonctionne pas. Mais on ne peut pas le corriger, le réparer par des argumentaires. Il faut travailler ensemble, il faut coopérer pour avoir un auto qui va réussir dans cette course parce que c'est une course pour l'humanité. And it's not just future generations as some theoretical concept, Mr. Speaker. It is actually people alive today. I mean, think about the projections that we could have a 10% chance of having the vast majority of this planet not able to actually support human habitation, not grow the food, not have adequate fresh water, not have fish protein for human consumption by 2100, by the end of the century. Well, my niece's son is 1 year old. That means he will be 88. It is today, it is people alive today that are faced with the risks that our society is imposing on their future, and that is completely unacceptable. We need to cooperate to deal with this. We cannot keep playing political games like this motion actually embodies. So in the motion talks about grave concern with the impacts of a 2-degree rise in global average temperatures. And Mr. Speaker, for all the lack of commitment in the Conservative Party's part, that government actually did sign the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord, which is operational immediately, states, and I will quote, "We underline that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. We emphasize our strong political will to urgently combat climate change in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities." Mr. Speaker, where is that urgency in this government's action? We see urgent communications to try and convince Canadians they're doing something when, in fact, they are taking us backwards with every month that passes. In the Copenhagen Accord, this Conservative government signed their agreement that, in quote, "We agree that deep cuts in global emissions are required according to science and as documented by the IPCC Fourth Assessment Panel with a view to reduce global emissions so as to hold consistent with science and on the basis of equity. We should cooperate in achieving the peaking of global and national emissions as soon as possible." And I could continue. So this is what the Conservatives actually signed, but what they're doing is completely antithetical to that supposed commitment. In fact, unfortunately, this is a government that has consistently embarrassed Canada onto the international stage, and been obstructive in climate change negotiations. In fact, finally, even ripping up their binding legal international agreement under Kyoto. One would think that this is not an issue of concern. To take that kind of step to smear Canada's reputation on the world stage, one would think that that would suggest that this is not an issue for the Conservatives. And in fact, that is what their actions would suggest. So contrary to the International Monetary Fund, and I would comment that the new president of the IMF has been very clear that climate change is actually one of the major economic threats for the future of the global economy. This is a government that does not seem to consider it a concern at all. And I'll quote the IMF Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, who is a former Conservative finance manager of France, when she said that the real wild card in the pack of economic pivot points is increased vulnerability from resource scarcity and climate change, with the potential for major social and economic disruption. And she called, as I said, she called climate change the greatest economic challenge of the 21st century. Sounds like that's something that one would imagine the Conservative government would actually listen to or take account of. But on the contrary, this is a government that has a focus set on accelerating development of Canada's fossil fuel commodities, from oil sands to shale gas to coal, at the expense of capturing any of the market investment, or virtually any of the market investment, in the thriving clean energy market. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm quoting a study here that's called Competing in Clean Energy, Capitalizing on Canadian Innovation in a $3 trillion economy. And this is a market that is set to grow much more quickly than the other aspects of our economy. However, in Canada, venture capital investment, especially from large institutional investors, is declining in terms of clean energy, the clean tech sector. It's declining from $3.3 billion in 2000 to less than $1 billion in 2012. And I'm quoting, and Canadians have landed only 2% of clean energy patents granted in the United States since 2002, compared with Korea's 5%, Germany's 7%, and Japan's 26%. So the advice of the Canadian clean energy sector is have a level playing field, have some certainty for business, get rid of the subsidies for the oil and gas industry, subsidies that include the absence of a price on carbon, that include the absence of actually regulating that industry. There's been a lot of talk, but there has been no action. And this Conservative government's plans on that, in that regard, are also considered to be amongst the most ineffective and costly approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, and Mr. Speaker, I do want to also add that there are enormous opportunities to actually taking action on greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also economic, not just environmental costs, as the member from Etobicoke North has been so eloquently able to lay out for us today, but there's also economic costs to not taking action, and those are the kinds of tariffs that other countries are putting in place. Carbon taxes like Japan's on our coal exports to Japan. Canada is now having a massive wealth transfer of approximately $400 million every year into the Japanese treasury because Japan has a price on carbon and Canada does not. And that's just the beginning. Japan is poised to put the same legislation in place for oil, for natural gas, for bitumen, so that all of those products exported to Japan, for those products, the Japanese government will collect a tariff, a massive wealth transfer into the Japanese treasury, a competitor nation, because of a failure to act by this government in Canada. So I want to go to the section in this motion that is about condemning the lack of effective action by successive federal governments since 1998 to address emissions and meet our Kyoto commitments. I'll start by asking the member from Windsor West, who is celebrating the reductions that Lafarge Cement has made. That is to be celebrated. And in my province, it's not just the cement industry, it was the aluminum industry, it was the pulp industry, it was the transportation industry, the oil and gas industry. These industries began to make changes to their processes and their technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they started to do that back around 2000. Why? Because of the Liberal government's voluntary reduction registry. And it worked. There was up to 35% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by the pulp sector. So, Mr. Speaker, the idea that the Liberal government did nothing is completely fallacious. And in fact, I was right at the table in those days. I was the Environment Minister in British Columbia from 2001 to 2004. And I had a chance, not as a federal Liberal, but as a member of a provincial government, to witness the activities of the federal Liberal government of the day. And what I want to say is, when we have an issue that is this woven through the fabric of our society and requires this much cooperation, it also requires education and understanding. And that is what the Liberal government from 1997, when it signed onto the Kyoto Protocol, began to do, began to educate the Canadian public, who at that point didn't know much about this. Now, I understand some members here have been deeply engaged in this issue for many years, not the ones that have been cackling from across the aisle, mind you, but some on this side of the House. And in fact, I wrote my Master's of Business Administration thesis on just this issue in 1992. But the bulk of the public was not of awareness of this issue when the Liberal government began working on it. So part of what the government did was to begin to bring the public on board and to begin to have public understanding of individual actions that could take place, cooperating with the public. Part of what the Liberal government did was work through the Federation of Municipalities, FCM, so that municipalities understood their role in this and began to become champions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we see municipalities today and these federations, whether it's provincial or countrywide, as leaders in greenhouse gas reductions because of their partnership cooperating with the federal Liberal government of the day. The Liberal government began working with industry, began doing industry by industry negotiations so that the kinds of reductions that they would make would not harm their competitive chances and would not harm their businesses, but would contribute to greenhouse gas emission reductions. And it worked. It worked right across the country. And then they began working with provincial governments. And I was the representative of our provincial government, Mr. Speaker. I witnessed the Liberals of the day in 2001, 2002, 2003 do an extensive set of modeling. How can we actually accomplish our goals in a way that is fairest for the provinces, fairest for industry and for individuals, and as cost-effective as possible? That modeling and those conclusions were then brought to me, to our provinces, to reflect on, to analyze ourselves, and to give input into. And then the modeling was redone, taking in the information provided by the provinces. Now that's called consultation. I know that the government, the Conservative government of today, does not even know that word. Why consult? They know better than anybody about everything. Well, in fact, the Liberal government consulted, and that is how they got the provinces on board. And Mr. Speaker, in British Columbia, I had the privilege of leading an initiative that brought the captains of industry and others who were interested in this issue together to work with our cabinet on how we can move forward on this. And out of that, we came up with a climate change plan in 2004 that involved every ministry reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions and those of their partners. Following that, in 2007, in the throne speech, the provincial government of British Columbia launched their greenhouse gas reduction plan that is widely admired across North America today. And an audit has shown that greenhouse gas emissions has actually declined 15% since 2008 under the BC Liberal greenhouse gas reduction plan at minimal or no impact to the economy. Now that ties in to the partnership the federal Liberal government made with the provinces to do bilateral agreements to support the provinces in bringing forward their own plans and doing their own activities. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government in 2005 had Project Green putting down the final piece of their roadmap to action. And that was a regulatory tool that would have accomplished the Kyoto targets had the government of Canada not changed. So the Liberals did nothing. That is one of the biggest fictions of our politics today. The Liberals set the entire framework for the actions that have been done. And I was there as witness to it. And British Columbia was on board because of it. But what happened next? What happened in the fall of 2005 when the Liberals were poised to put that last piece of the puzzle in place? The NDP made a decision that they knew better. They thought it would be better to have a Conservative government. It would be better for climate change to have the current Prime Minister in charge. It would be better for Canada's reputation to pull down the government of the day and put a Conservative government into the driver's seat. Whoa, what a mistake. But to then bring this motion forward claiming that the Liberals did nothing is the height of hypocrisy, and very disappointing to me as someone who works constructively. I would like to believe with many members of the NDP party. So, Mr. Speaker, I know my time is drawing to a close. I'm just getting going here. I'm having a lot of fun. But I remain highly disappointed that we have to have partisan wedge issue motions.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Thank you very much. And, I usually do get along quite well with the member for Vancouver Quadra, but I couldn't help but engage in this debate after, frankly, just offensive. I mean, the idea that voters didn't know what they were voting for, they elected a non-Liberal government 3 times in a row, and they did so in part because the last Liberal leader on the question of climate change and the environment said, quote, "We didn't get it done." Right. And if she doesn't believe that the government of Canada, under any auspices, should be moving forward with the natural resource extraction industries, then maybe she ought to question her own current Liberal leader, who of course supported the Nexon deal, who believes in the Enbridge pipeline project, who thinks that we should go further in that regard. And also, perhaps she could explain why it is that when the environment was such a front and center issue, the Canadian public looked at the Liberal proposal of a green shift, a carbon tax plan, and rejected it. And then she comes in the House and says, well, the Canadian public is just stupid. They're stupid because they didn't elect us, because we know so much more. They put their plan straight forward. It was clear. The public saw it, and they rejected it. Don't insult Canadian taxpayers by suggesting they didn't know what they were voting for. They knew very well what they were voting for. And they knew very well what they were voting for. When she was the Environment Minister for the province of British Columbia, she won fossil awards for her failures as Environment Minister on the question of climate change. And if she wants to talk about elections and getting things done, her own former Liberal leaders said the Liberals failed to get it done. There was a 30% increase in GHG emissions. They won the carbon awards, and that's why they were rejected the last 3 elections in a row, and it's why she was rejected as Environment Minister in British Columbia.
Order. I see there is abundant interest in questions and comments for this round. I ask members to keep their interventions to around a minute or so. The Honourable Member for Vancouver Quadra.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think I may have hit a bit of a nerve on the other side of the aisle. I haven't seen the Minister of Heritage this excited in a long while, and in fact. I would note that it is that member who has put some very negative words in. It's out of his mouth has come some very negative characterizations of the public, not from mine. So perhaps that is what that member thinks of the public. But I will answer one part of that diatribe, and that has to do with our carbon resources. Our carbon resources are important assets, and it is the oil and gas industry itself that is saying we want a level playing field, and it is the industry itself that is saying pricing carbon through a carbon tax is actually a more cost-effective way than through these cumbersome red tape regulatory framework that the government is talking about and has yet to even launch 7 years of government, and they have done nothing.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Brossard-La Prairie.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais continuer un peu là-dessus. Les libéraux disent que maintenant c'est la faute du NPD parce que justement les Canadiens ont refusé ce qu'ils avaient proposé. Je me souviens justement en 2008, lorsque les libéraux disaient qu'ils allaient mettre de l'avant une taxe sur le carbone. Nous, on mettait de l'avant un marché du carbone. Par la suite, ils ont changé en 2011 et maintenant ils changent encore. On ne sait pas c'est quoi leur position. Mais un des problèmes qu'on a, surtout avec les libéraux, et je pense que l'honorable collègue là justement dit que ils n'ont rien fait. Elle a dit qu'ils ont fait une consultation, et puis ça c'est bien, je suis d'accord, comparativement aux conservateurs, il n'y a pas de consultation, mais elle a avoué qu'ils n'ont pas mis de mesures. Et c'est pour ça que notre motion est très bonne. On dit clairement qu'on dénonce le manque de mesures concrètes des gouvernements fédéraux qui sont succédés depuis 1998. Et donc, je crois que là-dessus, l'honorable collègue devrait être d'accord. Et peut-être nous dire c'est quoi sa mesure. Est-ce que c'est la taxe sur le carbone ou le marché du carbone? Qu'est-ce qu'ils ont décidé?
The Honourable Member for Vancouver Quadra.
Merci beaucoup. Et je veux répondre aux membres que il y avait des mesures concrètes. Il y avait plusieurs des mesures. C'est pour ça que le taux des émissions de gaz à effet de serre a plafonné 2005. Ils ont commencé à descendre 2006. C'est à cause des mesures, pas à cause d'une économie dans récession. C'était à cause des mesures concrètes au niveau des individus dans notre société, les industries principaux et toutes les négociations avec les provinces. Et les provinces, les communautés ont commencé eux-mêmes d'entamer des mesures pour baisser leurs émissions. Merci.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Lac Saint-Louis.
Speaker, the Minister of Heritage was talking about the Canadian public rejecting certain ideas and so on. But if I recall, the Conservative Party, especially when Mr. Obama was on the rise, the Conservative Party embraced the idea of carbon markets, and people voted for them. So were they? It seems to me that the Canadian public was supporting the kinds of policies that would help combat climate change. It's just that the Conservatives didn't deliver. What would the members say to that?
Well,
The honourable member for Vancouver.
a very accurate observation. This is the Conservatives ran twice, in 2006 and in 2008, on a promise to do a cap-and-trade system, which is a carbon market system, which actually it's one of the principal ways of putting a price on carbon. So it is true. The public must have felt that must have perceived this party and this government as one that might be willing to act, but unfortunately that's not the case. And not only that, any of the organizations that are pointing at the best way to manage this, the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a way that is fair, that is effective, that is efficient, organizations like its own appointed National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. As soon as they use the word climate change, that's it, their history. So this is not a government that anymore is interested in having advice and counsel on how to be effective.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Peterborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, picking up a little bit on where the Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage left off, it's interesting. It's not just the Canadian public rejected Liberal proposals over the last three campaigns, of course mindful of their woeful record with respect to climate change. I think it's also, you know, it's something to hear them continue to retread through ideas that have been rejected and present them once again as though they're new or things that should be uptaken even though the Canadian public have said something quite different. Does the member understand that there is a world price for oil? There is a world price for gasoline. And oil companies like the idea of a carbon tax principally because they will get the world price for oil or gasoline regardless, but the carbon tax would then be paid by Canadian consumers and it would completely exempt them. However, if they're actually regulated, they'll have to absorb these costs and only receive the world price for oil and gasoline. Oil companies aren't charitable organizations. Important industry for Canada, but they're not charitable.
Honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has some arguments to make there that completely ignore the fact that it is imperative to actually do something that works. And this is a government that has failed to do that. While positioning itself as a government that has gone halfway to meeting its obligations under its own rather weak targets, it turns out, it was wrong. It was actually calculating what would happen if oil and gas emissions and other carbon emissions skyrocketed and counting halfway down from that. It's actually on track to increasing emissions since 2005, not reducing them by 17% as it had proposed. And the International Energy Agency, which is really represents the energy industries, is calling is saying that il est impératif de développer rapidement des technologies énergétiques à faible émission de carbone afin d'éviter que la planète ne subisse un réchauffement potentiellement catastrophique. Like, that's the IEA saying that, and what is this government doing besides trying to pull the wool over the Canadian public?
We have time just for one short question. L'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Moi, j'ai juste une toute petite question, ça ne sera pas long. Je me demande comment ma collègue peut arriver au même diagnostic que nous